Welcome back, everyone. This is my oldest son, JR, and this is my middle child, Maxwell. The last time I did a compilation video where we went from tree to finished piece on the serpentine chest, you all seem to really like that, so we're going to do that again with this bed that I made for JR almost a decade ago, which is crazy it's been that long. So we'll go back, we'll pick up the tree. That was right after I had learned how to weld, and you were like 4 months old. And I had modified the old trailer before realizing that it wasn't really built strong enough for what I wanted to do with it, which was a great learning experience. And then we ended up building this bed because we had you, Maxwell, and JR. We needed to get out of the crib that I also made for you guys so you could have somewhere to sleep in the crib. And then at one point, we had Eloise, and then she needed a crib, and we were still at the old house. We didn't have room for another bed. So you guys shared this bed, and I have so many memories of like early fatherhood, of putting you guys to bed every night and spending a lot of time in this bed, reading stories, and just getting through the chaos of toddler life.
Yeah.
But anyways, what do you guys think? We jump back in time. We're gonna go back to November 2015.
Yay.
Hello. All right, so today we're gonna try out this log thing. This guy going to try and get a log on this trailer. We'll see how this goes. It should be a fun adventure, since Steam has no details except the address and the time. It's like a little drug deal.
I don't even know what the guy looks like.
This is Dima's friend Alex, and he was hired to remove this walnut tree. Since part of the removal involves disposal of the tree, Alex asked if we wanted it. This offer came at a perfect time, as it would be a good test for my log lift that I recently built for my trailer. Alex was trying to get the tree to fall into the open lawn, but it ended up wanting to go the other way, so I had to pull it over with the rope. After a lot of pulling and tightening up the rope, it finally came over. We helped Alex load the brush onto his trailer, and then we could start loading the trunk. We rolled it back up the hill a bit so the approach angle would be a little more direct, since I wasn't able to get my trailer more in line with the log. The first part of the lift went well, and we positioned some smaller logs underneath to help protect the lawn.
Keep going.
Keep an eye on the arch's left mount. This is when it starts to fail. As I discovered later, the bottom of the mount was only tacked to the trailer. This was the only thing keeping it from lifting up. With no attachment point on the bottom, the rest of the mount was free to shear away. With the log up on the trailer, the homeowner requested that the log be cut to a shorter length to make it more manageable. And back up the hill again. We positioned the log on the right side to hopefully put most of the force on the other mount. The only thing holding the left mount to the trailer at this point was the bead along the top. This went really well, and with the front of the log on the trailer, I could just winch it the rest of the way on.
Nothing to say.
Dima and I threw the smaller logs on the trailer, and we were off. Normally to unload logs, I just chain the log to this tree and drive off. This time I wanted to mill the log so it was up on the back of the trailer, so I thought I'd try something a little more controlled. This gave me an opportunity to play with the winch some more. The log ended up wedging itself into the edge of the lawn, so I did have to try my old pull forward method. I attached my ladder and started cutting, and wow, this was so much easier with gravity working with me. My parents were in town visiting this weekend, so my dad was out here helping me with this. Chainsaw milling is always easier with two people, and with the added gravity push, this was the easiest log I've ever cut. When the first cut was made, I could start repetitive slabbing cuts. I set my mill to 2 1/8 inch, and these cuts took about 4 to 5 minutes each.
Nice butt. The smaller log I milled right on the bed of the trailer, which made for a really easy cleanup. I was really excited about this one because I was really looking forward to seeing what this 3-way crotch would look like. I'm cutting these to the same thickness of 2 1/8 inch, and each of these cuts took about 1.5 to 2 minutes. And lastly, we stack them to dry. I used 2 concrete blocks for this log since it's easier to get 2 blocks leveled than a bunch of them. We set down the first slab and I adjusted the blocks until the slab lay flat on its first sticker. I can then do some coarse adjustments by packing some dirt under the blocks, and then I can use some shims to take out the remaining twist. Then we can just stack them in the sequence they were cut, and to save some space, we stack the smaller log on top of the larger one.
Hey everyone, my name is Matt. Welcome to my shop. So it was about a year ago that I posted the video of the build of my son JR's crib. And since then, we've had a second son. My son Max was born about 2 months ago, and he is gonna need a crib pretty soon. So our plan is to move JR into a bed, a twin size bed, and then my son Max will get the crib. So first, let's go pull out this lumber, and then we'll head back in here into the shop, and we'll talk a little bit about the design that I have planned for this bed. So here's my indoor drying area, and the slabs I'm going to use for the bed, at least for the headboard and the footboard, are down here, and the rails. This walnut down here, which I think I brought in here maybe 6 months or so ago. It's been dry for a long time. I actually haven't been swapping out the stack very often. I've been so busy I haven't been drying much lumber recently. So this stack area here is kind of tucked away in the corner of my basement, and in this area here that I have allotted for this, you can do about 1,000 board feet at a time and still have room for some weight on top. So the weight I use to hold the stack down flat to the ground is all the stuff that I already dried and doesn't need any stickers between them. So all the stuff from this point up, it's already dry. This is just lumber I have for, whatever. So today I want to start pulling all the stuff out of here. I actually want to empty this entire stack out because I want to bring in a bunch of new stuff I've been cutting on the sawmill. And all this stuff's been here for so long, it's already dry. So this stuff can go out in the shed, and I can move it out there and use this space to actually dry stuff again. So the biggest advantage of drying indoors like this is I can get the moisture content down to the equilibrium moisture content of indoor furniture, which in my case here is about 8%. I can get the lumber sitting in the basement here down to 8% really easily and relatively quickly compared to just air drying outdoors. So I'm going to start pulling the stuff out of here, and I'm going to put it all out on the patio with the stuff that's wet that needs to come in. There's a lot of lumber here, so it'll probably take me a good amount of time. So it's interesting going through this stuff and remembering all the cool boards that I have. There's some really, really interesting stuff in here. Oh boy. All right. So from that tree there were 2 logs. There was a small log with 3 crotches and then the main trunk. And this is a piece of something else. Butternut looks like. Yeah, so these 2 here are butternut. First cut off the main trunk. It's gonna be mostly sapwood. Nothing crazy there. And this is the first cut off of the multi-crotch thing. So this is probably going to be too short to use for rails on the bed. And I want to use the wider boards for the head and footboard since you'll be seeing those. So I think this is going to be set aside for future projects. I forgot how many logs I had with that tree. I had some of the upper canopy too. That's what this is. Also probably going to be too narrow for this project. But come in handy for something, I guess. This is more of that triple crotch stuff. These are going to be too short for this project. Now we're getting to the headboard stuff. This is also too small, I think. So given this width that I have here, I got about 12 inch wide board through here. So what I'm thinking I'll probably end up doing is I could probably make the headboard and the footboard out of only 2 boards. I should be able to get, how long are these? I'll have to see on the length, but I'm hoping I can just cut them in half and have 8 feet. So they're 8 feet long, so I'm hoping I can cut them in half and have enough stock for a footboard and then a headboard, and then both the headboard and the footboard will be book matched to get the full size that I need. And while I'm here, I've got the moisture meter. You can take a look and see how dry the stuff is. Sitting around 9%, which is pretty good. 8, 7.9 over here, 6 down here, 8, 8.5. So one thing I can do is I have these blocks here. These are totally dry. These are offcuts from when I made the crib, and they've been sitting in the basement here. So this is my equilibrium standard for walnut. Same species, same environment. So in other words, when my stuff has been drying, matches the same moisture content as the stuff that's been in here for a long time, this is as dry as it's gonna get. So this stuff's sitting at about 8.1-ish. That's pretty much close enough. And that's 7.1 there. So there's gonna be a range throughout the board. And of course, there's gonna be a difference because of the 2 different pieces of wood. There could be 2 different densities. They're from 2 different areas of the country. Who knows where they're from? Well, I know where they're from. They're both from here. But they're from 2 different trees, so density could be different. But plus or minus 1%, that's pretty good. All right, so now I want to get the stock for the posts out, and this is the stuff I've been dreading the most. This is some of my other lumber storage. This is underneath the stairs in our laundry room, and I have all of my own personal collection in here. And the stuff I want to use for the posts is right here. It's a couple pieces of 12-quarter maple. You already saw me pull one of the boards from that tree out when I pulled the stock for the headboard and footboard. That was one of the boards on top. The other 2 are in the stack. So I have a lot of stuff in here. This is kind of a goofy room with this support post here, and I have that little room back here. So I don't really remember how I got a lot of stuff in here. It was either back into there and then out this way, or maybe sneak out through here through this other door here. But I used to stack and dry my lumber underneath the stairs here. It worked if you had a fan on it, because there's not a whole lot of airflow in here. But the other reason is it's just a pain in the butt to get wood in and out of here. So I did it a couple times with a few hundred board feet, and it was just ridiculously annoying. So that's when I moved the stack to the other area of the basement, a little more out in the open, which made it a lot easier to stack. But my wife loves me. I don't know why. So I think since I don't have to go that far down the stack, we've got maybe 100 board feet sitting on top of the stuff I need. I'm just gonna probably just stack it on the floor in here, and hopefully that should be enough to still walk around and maneuver. Now over here I have all of my rough turn bowl blanks that are sitting on top of my stack of lumber, which I also have to remove. I've got some blocks for mallet heads, and I've got all these bowls to move. So this is most of the rough turn bowls I have. I have some more out in the shop, but I really just enjoy green turning. It's just a lot of fun. And my whole thought process with this if I have a whole bunch of bowls, they're all rough turned. They can be finish turned at any point if I need to bring a gift somewhere or just feel like finish turning. But pretty rarely do I feel like finish turning, because turning dry lumber is a lot more dusty. It's a lot more hard on the tools. You don't get those big, giant shavings flying around. It's just not as much fun, at least to me. So this is probably as far as most of these things will ever get. I guess that's one way to get them out of the way. Hey, looking for this thing. Got my wife's sombrero. Why we have this, I have no idea. So it looks like I should have enough space to kind of pull the boards back that way to clear the staircase, and I can just pull them out towards the camera there out the door. And then I should be able to just kind of stack them in place right here on the floor. Oh, this is perfect too. So if you've been following along, you know I'm planning to build a tool cabinet this year. Well, this is the lumber right here, and I'm planning to build a tool cabinet out of some box elder that I've had for a long time. So I will be able to keep that out, so I don't have to worry about digging it out again when it's time to build a tool cabinet. That's exciting. That's gonna make a cool tool cabinet. Love all that color. All right, we got more cherry. I have some 8-quarter cherry. And I've had this stuff for a long time. Actually, I've had this cherry for like 5.5 years. This is from the first batch of lumber that I dried here in this house when we moved here. And this is my nicest walnut. The clearest, best looking color that I have. Still haven't used it. Got a whole bunch of sequential boards. As you can see, this is incredibly not fun. The few pieces of, I think this is birch. I think it was 6 years ago, 6 Christmases ago. This is what my in-laws got me as a Christmas gift. They got me like 100 board feet of whatever from a local sawmill that I then dried. I still have a bunch of it. This is the widest walnut board from that set. I think it's like 18 inches wide. I have no idea how it gets in here. Oh boy. So another thing I'm building this year is a highboy. And this maple is the same maple that I used as secondary wood when I built the secretary desk. So I think what I'm going to do is use this same maple for the highboy as well. So again, this is something else I can kind of put towards the top or set aside, so I don't have to worry about pulling this stuff out again later. I think there should be enough material here for that whole highboy. It's going to have a lot more drawers than the secretary desk did. So it's going to require a lot more material. But I think there should be enough here. Alright, some more 8-quarter cherry. Same batch as that other one. Of course, I'm a little tired now that I finally got down to these things and I see how big they are and how little fun they're going to be to pull out of here. Oh boy. So a little bit of story about the slabs I'm trying to dig out of here. I cut these over Christmas, I think 4 years ago. We were at my in-laws for Christmas that year, and one of my wife's childhood friends was in town, and he had purchased some land near where his parents lived. And he wanted to try some chainsaw milling, so I brought my chainsaw mill out there, and we cut up a red oak log, and I cut some 16-quarter red oak for him. After we did that, he said I could pick out anything there in the woods and cut it up for myself. So I found this maple tree, and I wasn't really sure what kind of maple tree it was. It had its top snapped off, so I cut that down, and we cut up one of the logs into the 3 slabs that I have here. Now, I wasn't super careful about drawing them. They were pretty heavy, so I kind of put them at the top of my stack and didn't put any weight on top of them or anything. So they do have some warping to them. They have a pretty good amount of bowing and twisting in them, which I didn't really care about because I figured these would just become square stock anyway. And for leg stock or for turning stock or something, you don't need a whole lot of length. So a little bit of distortion in the wood isn't going to make that much of a difference. So a question I get a lot is, how do I come up with designs for furniture? And I'm not super creative. I don't go out into nature and like see things out there and make my stuff based off of that. Most of the things that I build are going to be derived from some piece of furniture that already exists, and then I might change that the design to suit my needs or to suit the lumber that I have. And this is no exception. So the inspiration for this bed came from this one here. This was a bed built by Craig Jentz, and this was displayed at the Northern Wood Show in 2016, which is a show that the Minnesota Woodworkers Guild puts on every year. So this is the bed that I saw there, and my wife likes the design as well, so I think that definitely helps. There's a few things that I specifically like about this. I like the curvature in the headboard and the footboard. These are actually a little more coopered, so that is basically that there's a bunch of boards there and they're all cut at an angle, so they're essentially staves, and that approximates a curve. So I like that aspect of it. I also like the large legs. The top of them are, I think they were exactly 4x4, so the overall size of the leg is probably around 5x5. I kind of like the shape of the leg, but I might do something different. I'm not really that sure yet. So that's kind of a starting point, and it gives me some inspiration of how I can design my own kind of bed. Now, this also is probably a double or a queen size bed. I'm making a twin size bed, so I need to scale this down to the dimensions that I need and all that stuff tof So for that, I'll go into SketchUp and do some rough drawing just to kind of get some dimensions. I don't really need to draw the whole thing out because I kind of know how things are going to come together. So I just need to kind of put things together to figure out the dimensions of most of the components. So since I'm making a bed, all of the dimensions for all the components of this whole bed project are going to be derived from the size of the mattress. So what I did here was I just drew out the size of a twin mattress to give me a good starting point. And from there I can actually use that length to figure out the length of the rails I'm going to need. So I can draw in a rail. Now the rails, I figured I want those to be a little bit longer than the mattress, and that'll give some room for the blankets to be tucked in on the top or the headboard and the footboard. And at some point I'll make it so that the whole thing is a little bit wider so the blankets can be tucked in alongside the rails. But again, for now, it's trying to get to some rough dimensions. Now from this point I can draw in a leg, and I can kind of play with some setbacks of how far the rail is going to be from the end of the leg. Here I just went with like a 1-inch offset just to kind of get some idea of scale and just appearance. Now at this point I really don't know how long I want the posts to be or how tall I want them to be, so I'm just kind of drawing them in there for now at some arbitrary length. One thing I can do here while I'm looking at this is I can decide or kind of look at it and see how tall the rail should be in comparison to the leg. This is an 8-inch tall rail, and it might be a little bit tall. Maybe a 6-inch might be a little better. Something I can play with as I look at the wood, especially if I have something that's going to work really well. It's only 6 inches wide as opposed to something that's 8 inches wide. I might just go to a 6-inch wide thing wide rail just because it's the wood I want to use. It's not important at this point, but I can kind of figure out how high I want the bed to be off of the ground. This is for my son. He's only a year and a half old, so he needs to be able to actually get up into the bed. And I don't really feel like making steps or something, but I don't want to make it too low that it's kind of weird looking in the future. So details like that aren't that important at this point right now, since I'm really just trying to get to some main dimensions so I can get the wood figured out. So from there, I can kind of look towards the headboard and the footboard. I already decided that the headboard and the footboard are going to be pretty much the same thing, so I'm just going to draw in the headboard. So before I even pulled the lumber, I knew that the boards I'm going to be dealing with are going to be about 12 inches wide. So that's what I drew in here. I just drew a 12-inch wide board that's about 1.5 inches thick, and I just kind of drew that in there flat up against the legs. And then I figured, well, we can put another board next to it. So this is tipped back at 10 degrees, and I might consider tipping back this bottom one as well. So that's at an angle to the front edge of the post. That might make it a little more comfortable, a little more interesting. Now the footboard, I'm going to do exactly the same thing. I probably want it to be a little bit shorter. So what I'll do there is most likely just start the footboard lower on the post than the headboard so that it ends up a little bit shorter. So one thing I'm still thinking about here, again, is the length of that post. I'm not sure if I want it to be the same size or the same height as the headboard, or shorter than it, or taller than it, but I have some time to kind of think about that. And that just gives me some insight on the size of everything needs to be, so I can start roughing out the parts. I just personally prefer to work with the wood itself and kind of let the wood decide what it wants to do as far as dimensions go, and just use the computer model as a basic plan just to get me started in breaking this stuff down. Now, as I'm looking at this, I'm kind of changing my mind on a few things just by looking at the wood. So for instance, here on the headboard, I'm planning on using the crotch section of the slabs, and then the footboard will be made from the bottom section of that without the crotch in there. So I'm thinking it might be kind of cool to do a live edge for the top of the headboard. So along the top, there's this live edge there, and then this actually stays into the board, or into the headboard, with this kind of jet up in the air thing. So that kind of goes back to the post length. Do I want the post to end here? Do I want it to go all the way to the top here? So the post would be all the way at the top of one side, and then the post would be taller than the headboard on the other side of the headboard. If they're the same height, the post would be up here, and there'd be some dead space beneath it. I'm kind of thinking maybe I want the post to come to this point on the headboard, and this just sticks out freely in the air. That's just something to consider at this point, but I think I'm strongly leaning towards evolving this bed into having more live edge components. Now, something else I'm thinking about doing is leaving the bottom edge of the rails as a live edge. I'm thinking about using this board here for at least one of the rails. I think that might be a cool look, and it might tie in nicely to the headboard. The nice thing about leaving it live edge is if I don't like the look of it, I can just cut it off and square it up and get rid of it. So it's kind of nice in that sense that I can build it with the live edge. If I don't like it, I can always change my mind, and it's not going to be detrimental at all. So the other thing I'm doing here that I'm kind of deviating from the bed that Craig made is I'm using walnut for the rails as well as the headboard, and maple for the footboard. Now, one thing that definitely varies from Craig's design to my design is that Craig didn't use any sapwood in the headboard or the footboard where the walnut is. I am planning to. I think the sapwood in the walnut is going to tie in really nicely to the light color in the maple. It's actually going to blend together pretty well because the sapwood is going to be pretty much the same color as the maple. So that could be a pretty cool tie-in, and I think it's going to be a nice way to integrate that sapwood into the project really elegantly. So since the design video, I've kind of made some decisions, and actually that video was like 12 hours ago. So in the last 12 hours, I've kind of made up my mind. So I'm going to go ahead with the live edge on one edge of the rails to see how that looks. And I'm going to do the live edge on the top side of the headboard and footboard. I think it's going to be a really cool look. So the rails, I'm going to start with that. I grabbed the other slab from that set, so I have this pair of book matched slabs for those. This one I was kind of hesitant about using because it does get pretty narrow through here, but this I'll put to the back side, so you won't be able to tell how narrow it really is. I think there's still gonna be enough structure there for a bed, for a twin bed for a kid. And on this side it'll be around 5 inches wide by the time I put a straight edge on one side through this narrow area here, because I'm leaving that live edge, it's going to be a variable width board throughout its length. So I picked these for the rails especially because they have this crotch figure down here which I want to incorporate into the design. The rails need to be 76 inches long, so that would be down to around here. So what I'm going to do, I think what may be a really cool look is to have the crotch figure, or this like swoop in the bottom here, included in the rail, so that when it comes into the post, it kind of goes down, looking kind of like a brace, which I think might look pretty cool. So I'm going to end up cutting this down here to cut off this little bit of the limb up here. And normally I would just leave that on here and it's cut off later, but when it's dried, this limb kind of dove down a little bit. So to make it a little bit easier for the flattening process, I'm just going to trim that off now. So my final length is around here. I'm going to run it all the way so that this whole thing is around 80 inches long, and I'll cut that off and go from there. And I'm also going to draw on my straight edge so I can remove the live edge on one of the sides. And the side I'm going to use is the straighter side, or the side I'm going to remove is the straighter side, this side here, because also where it comes up into this limb here, if I extend a line from roughly the edge of the rails or the edge of the board out to here, that still includes all the crotch figure because now the area up here is figured. So to do that, I have a straight edge here. I'll just lay that on here. And I'm just going to be pretty conservative at this point because I'm just going to cut this on the bandsaw just to remove the bark and to get me started towards a straight edge. More material is going to be removed later at the jointer when I true up the edge and get it all squared up. So that's my cut lines for that one. And I can do the same thing on this slab here. So this is how that rail will be oriented in the final piece. This is the top edge. That's going to go towards the headboard probably, so that I get the tie-in of the crotch figure to the headboard, and then this will be to the footboard. So I can start making these rough cuts and I can start milling them down to dimension. So now I'm going to start working on the headboard and footboard layout. So these two slabs are book matched, so if you fold them up together, that's how they were in the log. A couple things I'll point out here. On the headboard side, I have this beautiful crotch figure that I want to incorporate into the bed. And if I book match them this way, that puts this crotch figure on this one to the bottom, which you're not going to see because the mattress is going to be there and the pillows and all that stuff. But to be honest, this side doesn't look as good. It actually like warped down pretty far because there isn't any material under here. It's all bark. So if I edge this off anyway, on the bottom side, I'm not really going to be losing a whole lot, but I still get the book matched look through the center. And what I'm really interested in is the stuff going on up here. So that's kind of the layout for the two slabs. I'm going to end up cutting these in somewhere in the middle here, and then there'll be another book match section down here for the footboard. Footboard isn't going to be as interesting. It's going to be pretty much all straight grain. So what I have written down here for the length for the headboard and footboard are 34 inches plus the joinery. The joinery I'm planning to use is like a breadboard end essentially. So I'm just going to allocate an extra maybe like 3 inches on each end for the joinery. So that puts me at 40 inches of rough length. So I'll probably go a little bit longer than that since I have 8-foot slabs here. Figure I want to preserve as much length as possible here. I want the slab to end here. The joinery will start around here. That'll give me an idea of where the length's going to end up being. So if that's the start of the slab, so if we go down to 40 inches, that's right here. So that's the headboard. Man, twin beds are small. It's not that long, so I'll probably cut them a little bit longer to kind of cut through this knot right here, just so I have the extra length again, just in case. I have the stock, I might as well use it. I really don't need a little 1-foot section of slab for something else in the future. And this will actually work out pretty well because Here is the next one. If I rough cut them the same length, that's right here where this kind of goofy end starts on the slab. Forget what happened when I was cutting these, but the saw must have dove, or it actually looks like maybe the saw died in this cut, and I cut the rest of it by hand with the smaller saw. I'll cut all of this off. This will be waste. Then the rest will be for the headboard and footboard. So only the top edge of the footboard and headboard are going to have that live edge. So that's the only one I'm going to leave, this edge here. The other 3 edges needs to get edged off, or the bark needs to be edged off to make this a little bit easier. So these slabs have a curve in it, so I'm going to lay out the straight edge separately on both halves of the slabs here. I want to preserve as much material on this side as possible, so I want this to be the side I edge. Okay, so I'll edge that side, and then I'll end up ripping this side parallel. So with those all drawn out, I can start cutting these and getting them milled with the just like the other stuff. So to plane these ones down and get the rest of that thing flat, got my little planer sled thing here. And this slides into my planer, and there's a stop on this side that just catches the lip of the table of the planer. And then this can just go on here. I can feed this whole thing through, and I'll ride this lip on the jointed edge off the side of this guy, and then this whole top face will be end up. Whew! Who's out of breath? And this whole top face of this board will end up flat because referencing off of this flat surface here, and then I can just flip the whole thing over, put this side that's now flat down on the planer bed, and then remove this little bit of this little lip material here, and this board will be nice and flat, wider than my jointer. Works out just fine. So I can flatten things up to 20 inches wide pretty easily. So my one where I'm trying to keep this live edge on the top with this crotch thing here, it's gonna be a little bit interesting because right here is like 20.5 inches, or about 20, almost 21 inches maybe. So it's gonna be a tight fit through my 20-inch planer. So what I'm hoping will happen here is I can get this thing all the way up against one side, and then the little nub there will clear the post. I'm hoping it'll still fit through, but it might not. So this might not work at all. I might have to pull this thing back out if it gets stuck. pretty nice looking, huh? So now I'll set those aside to rest for a few days. I'll set them on edge so they have airflow all the way around, and that'll allow them to reacclimate and move at all if they're going to distort out of flat. And while they're resting, I'll go ahead and do some of the epoxy work. There are some defects that I need to fill in these things. I'll do those now before I mill them again, and the milling process will clean up the epoxy. So now I can start working on the leg stock and getting these things glued up. So since I don't really know how long I want my post to be at this point, I'm just going to make them about 36 inches long, and that'll give me enough stock that I can cut them down to whatever length that I need. And what I'm trying to do here is reassemble these two slabs together so that the glue seam is seamless. So the closer I can get these things back together in exactly the same orientation they were when there used to be a tree, the better the glue seam is going to look. So what I'm going to do is cut these down into the rough lengths, and since this slab has a big crack in it, I'm going to run the bandsaw through the crack to separate these two, to separate this slab into two pieces, and I can use that cut line as a rough guide to cut the other slab down the middle to produce two pieces. And I think that way is going to be easier because it's really easy to get these things to come back together exactly as they were when you still have the bark line. So normally at this point you would joint and plane these things so you have nice flat boards that glue up really nicely. But I think I'm going to do something a little differently today. I'm actually going to skip the jointer and just plane them so I have a glue surface to put them together. The reasoning behind that is that these have a decent amount of twist in them. So if I was to flatten these and get them all ready for glue up that way, the traditional way using the jointer, I remove a lot of material from these things, and that's going to move the glue line further and further apart, so that's going to make the glue line more visible. So what I'm going to do is just run through the planer. They'll still have the deformation they have right now. They nest pretty well together, so they kind of deform in the same way. I'll glue them together, and then I can joint and plane the whole block together as one unit. That way where the boards come together, there's not a whole lot of material missing. I've already lost some material from the curve of the saw when I cut these into lumber. So the less material I remove now, the more natural that glue seam is going to look. So I'll just plane these until the surface is cleaned up enough for glue. So I have this all milled up, and you can kind of see here that since I removed material from between the slabs, or between where these two were in the tree, both by the sawmill and by planing these faces, I've probably removed about probably like a ½ inch of material from between these two slabs at this point. That's going to change the way that these intersect or they meet at this face. So that's why I didn't want to remove any more material than I had to, because I already knew there'd be a lot of material being removed. So I have to do my best now to line these things up as good as possible when I'm gluing them up so that the grain flows really nicely on the edge. And on this project especially, you're going to see the end grain of that post. So I want the end grain to look like it was natural and it's not like shifted over and all weird. So I'll be paying attention to the end grain particularly, and then I'll be probably aligning the edges so they're somewhere in the middle here. Wherever I can find the end grain looks the best, I'll try to keep that reveal consistent from one end to the other. Let's start with this pair. Here's some further proof that planer doesn't flatten anything. As you can see, both these still have twists in it, so I'll be forcing these together, and then whatever shape they end up having, that's just the shape that they'll be in. That's the high flow setting right there. Put this on top of here. And for this, I'm going to look at the end. So the end will show me where they need to go in this direction, because this is all cut all at once. I'll look at the end, look at the growth rings, see what those look like. Hopefully you can line them up so they actually flow together. I think it's going to be about as good as I'll be able to get. So now, since I'm forcing these boards together because they're not perfectly flat, I'm going to need a lot of clamps to make sure that the glue seam actually closes up all the way down the entire length. So I'll probably only be able to glue up, I don't even know, I might be able to only glue up one at a time based on the number of clamps I have. Alright, everything except my 4-footers. So every parallel clamp I have except 4. So I guess it's going to take me a few days to glue up all these posts. For something like this, because I'm trying to force these together, that glue seam is going to be stressed. I'll probably leave these in the clamps longer than I normally would. So probably at least 18 hours, just to make sure that glue is fully cured so that they don't start pulling apart. There's one glue up, I guess. I'll do the rest throughout the next few days, I guess. Oh, wow. That's a lot of clamp weight. So this leg stock's been sitting for about 5 days now. I think it's pretty much figured out its internal stresses. So I'm gonna go ahead and start cutting this up into square stock. So jointer, planer, bandsaw. So the stock for the bed has been sitting for a while now. The walnut's been sitting for about 2 weeks now, and the posts have been sitting for about a week since I milled them to this rough square size. So now they've been sitting for a while, they've deformed a little bit, and I'm ready to take them down to their final size to give them the last final milling. Now I'm pretty happy with the stability of the boards. The walnut didn't really move at all. There is a little bit of cup that returned, but not really much at all, maybe a 32nd of an inch, and these are still like 13 inches wide. So I'm pretty happy with that. That tells me these boards are very stable and they won't really deform or warp on me as I work. The posts as well didn't really move at all. They're still square. They haven't distorted at all, which is actually kind of surprising. On the post, I'm going to end up around 4.5 inches square, I think. That'll probably take it off enough material so that most of the bark is gone. And I have some glue seams here which kind of opened up a little bit. I wasn't able to close them over where the bark was, so there wasn't enough pressure in those areas, but that's all right. Taking them down to about 4.5 inches square should be good enough, and it should still have a fairly substantial look, which is what I'm going for. So everything's going to get run through the whole process again, jointer and planer, except this time I'm going to take everything down to the final dimension. The walnut is still pretty much a variable thickness. Every board is kind of different. I'm going to take them all down to the same thickness, down to whatever the one that ends up the thinnest ends up being, which is going to be the one for the headboard with a live edge. So I'll probably end up around 1.5 inches thick for the walnut stock, and then I'm going to go for 4.5 inches on the maple and see where that kind of leaves me. It's still pretty substantial, so if I need to remove more material, I can certainly do that, but I'll probably just stop there. So here is all the stock for the beds, all milled up and ready to go. And I am super excited about this because the stock is just so beautiful. There's so much color and so much interesting stuff going on here. This is going to be a really fun project. So with everything milled to size, I know the final dimension of my parts. I went back into SketchUp, went back to my model and made a few updates for the things that changed here. So in my model, I had the posts at 5 by 5, but in reality here they're at 4.5 by 4.5. So I made that change in here, which of course means that in order to keep that mattress opening the same, the headboard and footboard, the walnut needs to be lengthened by 1 inch to make up that difference. So that was one of the changes. The other thing is I kind of mess around with the height of the posts. I still am not really sure exactly where I want them to end up, but I'm thinking that they're going to, at least in my mind right now, they're going to end up just above the seam between the two boards in the headboard and footboard. I think that might be an interesting look, but we shall see. The nice thing here is I don't have to worry about cutting those posts to final length for a little while. And actually what I can do is just cut the bottom of the posts, square that side up, and I can leave them as long as I want until I'm ready to cut them to length. I can reference all my joinery off the bottom of the legs, which will be perfect. So the headboard and the footboard is where I'm going to start, or the walnut on the headboard and the footboard is where I'm going to start. These are still, the edges are still pretty rough from the bandsaw. They're not really square. The bottom side here, they're not really parallel yet, so I'm going to finish milling those up. And then I'll cut all these walnut headboard and footboard parts to final length. And then from there, I can start working on the joinery. So I haven't made a new crosscut sled yet for this table saw. So we're going to do the whole poor man's crosscut sled. Well, I guess technically it's a miter gauge. It's not really a sled at all, but you get the idea. So to keep the book match aligned and to make sure I only remove as much material as I need to just to square this up, I'm going to make a mark with a knife just to give me a cut line, and because I want to preserve as much of the crotch figure as possible. So ideally the cut would come right up to here, and that just trims off this extra bit here, and it's the least amount of material removed as possible, because then I have to come over another few inches for the joinery. So now I have the tongues on the lower portion of the headboard and the footboard, and I'm going to break up this tongue into individual tenons. And I think I'm going to break it up into 3 individual tenons, 1, 2, and 3, and that'll be the joinery that joins the walnut to the maple legs. Excellent. So I'll transfer this layout to the other 3 tongues and then start cutting this out, and also clean up this little bit of material left at the shoulder here where I left the dado blade back from the shoulder line. I like to use the crosscut blade first and then just clear out the waste of the dado stack, because my crosscut blade I know gives me a really clean cut and my dado blade might not. That's really about it. So this cleans up pretty quickly with a chisel, and then the rest can just get sawed out and move on to cut the mortises in the legs. All right, so the tenons are good to go on the headboard and the footboard. At this point, I'm going to start working on the legs. I'm going to start by cutting them to length. I've already laid them out in the order or the orientation that I want. So I picked out the ones for the headboard and the footboard left and right. So it's also worked out that I'm pairing the top and bottom half of those two slabs. So the ones for the headboard, for instance, are going to be the left and the right side of the slab. So there's some grain continuity along the center seam. Not that you're ever going to see them that close together, but it's an interesting detail. So now I can start laying out the mortises. So I have my two headboard posts here. I've arranged them so this is the front side, so this is the inside where the joinery is going to go. And I'm just going to make a quick couple of marks here so I know which way the headboard is going to angle, so I don't cut these in the wrong direction. So it's going to angle back. So I'll put some marks here so I know, and I can flip this forward. This will be my working face. So now I'm going to start laying out the mortises. I've cut this piece of MDF at the table saw at 5 degrees. This is going to be a bit of a guide for my router to cut those mortises. And the first thing I want to do is find out where the headboard and footboard are going to start. This is the headboard side, and I want the start of the headboard to be 11.5 inches off the floor. And it's going to be flush with the front side to start with. So if I measure up 11.5, it's going to start there. So I have this offcut from making that headboard. I can put that on here. I can kind of see how it's going to line up. I can put this on here if I want, and I can sort of arrange it like that. So that's basically how the headboard is going to come out of this post. So with my piece in position, I'm going to mark the center point of this so I can kind of get an idea of where that mortise is going to go. So right here. So now I'm just going to mark this out just so I have a really good idea of where this is going to go. So I'll just outline it real quick. And I can kind of go from there. So I'm going to cut these mortises with the router, with the guide bushing, and a 1/2 inch spiral bit. And that's going to ride against the edge of my angle template thing. So I know that my bit is a 1/2 inch, so the radius is a 1/4 inch, and then the offset between the outside of the bit and the outside of the guide bushing is 3/16. So to start the layout, I can start with the center line of the mortise. This is the radius of the bit, or the outside of the mortise. So on this side here, this will be a 1/2 inch wide. And then the 3/16 offset from the edge of the bit to the edge of the guide bushing is right here. So this is where I need to put my template. This thing. So now to figure out how to get this thing aligned, I can put a square on here, and I can put that up against the bottom here, and that's going to get it into alignment. And all I have to do is slide it in and out until I'm on my little line there, which is right here. And the last bit of the layout is to transfer the tenon locations so I know where to start and stop those. I'm also going to add this offcut from when I cut this. This is going to serve as a little bit of a channel, so I don't have to worry about the guide bushing coming away from this template too much. I'm going to set it away from here just enough so there is a little bit of clearance back and forth. So I'm still going to keep it against here, but this also helps to keep it from tipping off, and just generally it should help. So I'm just going to temporarily just super glue this down. A few little drops in a couple places here. That might be a whole lot, we'll see. And I have a little layout line on here, so I know how far away from the front edge to put this. So now I have a nice solid path for the guide bushing to travel through. So there's a little bit of side to side, so I can still slide the router pretty easily. But overall, even if I deviate from this side a little bit, it's not going to cause me too much of an issue. So the first step is going to be to create a groove a 1/2 inch deep that runs the full length of the tenon area to create that mortise for the stub tenon and the actual tenons, and then I'll come back and start plunging down at the individual tenon locations to bring those mortises down to 2 inches deep. So my bit's not long enough to go all the way down to the full depth here. I do have a longer spiral bit, but of course I don't know where it is. But I do have this straight bit, and I'll use this to clean up the very bottom of this. So I went ahead and I drilled some holes down in here with the drill bit to clear out the majority of the waste. This bit is a little bit scary to be running in here. The least amount of work this bit has to do, the better. So removing a little bit of material here, I can use this bit pretty easily. I can also come back in here if I wanted to instead of using the router and just clean up this last bit of material with the chisel. But since I have the router set up with the guide already, and the bit's the same size as the spiral bit that's in there right now, it's going to be a pretty simple matter of just swapping the bits, clearing out the waste, and then I'll be done with it. Alright, get this thing off of here. There. Okay, before I take this off, I'm going to do a couple of things. First, I'll make a line down here, so I just keep the alignment top to bottom as I go to my other leg over here. And I'm also going to take a measurement from the front here and just leave it in my combination square, so when I flip it over I can get this thing in the same spot on the other side, upside down from this. So now I can trim these tendons down to fit into the mortises. They're a little big still, not much, so a few passes with plane, and it should be good to go. That's pretty good. I could probably do a little bit of tune-up later, but that is fitting nicely. So now I'll get the other side to fit, and then the joinery on the headboard will be done. Well, for this part, I guess, until I join the other slab to the top of this. So now I can go ahead and remove this extra bit of material I left on the top portion of the head and footboard. I just made these cuts before when I was making the tendons on the bottom half, so I knew exactly where the shoulder to shoulder length was going to be. So the shoulder cuts that are on here right now are only there to give me the exact length that I need to cut the upper sections to, so that they'll fit exactly between the posts. So I'm going to gradually sneak up on the line here, and I'll probably clean this up, that final little bit of material at the bench, with a hand plane. There, that should be good for now. And then later on, when I do all my surface prep, I can clean up the last little bit of material here. So there we go. There's the basic headboard and footboard joinery. Looks like I managed to get them in the same or the right orientation. The footboard goes this way, headboard goes that way. So that's all good. So I think the last thing I want to do is to get the top edges of the headboard and the footboard of these boards beveled so that they can be joined to the top half, so that when these two things come together, they're going to be at a 5-degree angle, which means I need to put a 2.5-degree angle on both boards. So I think normally I'd probably do this at the table saw, but I think I'm going to try the jointer for this. I've honestly never used a jointer to do anything other than 90-degree cuts, so I think this could be a good time to try that out. The other nice thing here is, like, traditionally, like if you do it on a table saw, for instance, you would be referencing off the other edge, while the top edge of these pieces are going to be, the top edge of the top pieces are live edge, so there's nothing to really reference off of. They're not necessarily parallel, so there can't be any reference besides the edge itself to make this cut. So with the joinery on the headboard complete, the only other joinery in this project is to connect the rails to the posts. And that's going to be done with a stub mortise and tenon, and then there'll be a couple of bolts on the backside which pull that tenon into that mortise, keep it nice and snug, and also allows it to be disassembled pretty easily. So I have the rail stock here, and I rough milled this a couple of videos ago. And on the top side, the top edge, I want that to be pretty much nice and straight. I don't really want a live edge or any kind of deviation there. So the first thing I'm going to do is take these over to the jointer and remove enough material so that I can get mostly a straight edge on here without any of this curved stuff. On this one, I'm probably still going to have a little bit of a curve up here towards this side, but on the other side, this one here, I should be able to remove all the live edge and still have a significantly thick enough piece of wood for this rail. So I'm hoping I can keep the width of these consistent from left to right as I run them over the jointer. I'm going to take the same number of passes off of each, so hopefully they end up roughly the same width. If they're not exactly the same, not that big of a deal because they're not that close in the project. I'll never really be able to tell that one is slightly wider than the other one. So now I need to look at cutting these things to length, and the area that I'm most concerned about is up here where this crotch figure is, because I have these chunks here where this branch was cut off, and I wanted these to come right up into the post, but if I cut them there, I lose some of this crotch figure, which I guess isn't the end of the world, but I'm guessing that's probably what's going to end up happening. I don't really know if I like, if I were to cut it back to here, and I end up with like this little clipped area right here where it comes up to the post, I don't know if I really like that, so I think I'm still just going to come back and cut it off right at here, but I'm still going to add that little bit of material in here for that stub tenon. I think it'll still be okay. So I'll take these over to the chop saw, I'll get them cut to length, and then we can start working on the stub tenon. So I cut these stub tenons on the end of these long rails. I'll be pretty interested to do this at the table saw, so I'm going to do it pretty much, well, the cleanup or the finessing is going to be by hand, and then the majority of the waste is going to be removed with a router and an edge guide and a spiral bit. So the first thing I'm going to do is lay out the shoulder line onto the boards with a square. I'll wrap the shoulder line on these 3 sides here, and that'll give me the exact line for those shoulders. The router can then be used with the edge guide to remove the bulk of the waste, staying a little bit away from the line, and then I can chop back to the line with the chisel, clean it up perfectly, and I'll have a nice consistent shoulder line all the way around. And then the only thing left to do is to kind of blend in that bottom area, which would be pretty easy to do with the chisel or saw or something. So now I'll cut this tenon to length. On this end, the footboard end, I'm going to make this tenon 4 inches long, and then on the headboard side, it's going to be 6 inches long. I want the tenon to start a 1/2 inch from the top side here, so that'll give me a little bit of shoulder to cover any imperfections in the top of the mortise. So now I can start laying out the mortises. So I know the top of the rail is going to be 14 inches off the floor, and the tenon, or the shoulder on the top of the tenon, is going to be a 1/2 inch. So the top of the rail, or top of the mortise, is going to be right here. So I can make a scribe line across both these here. And then this is the headboard side, so that tenon is 6 inches long. So I can come down here 6 inches and mark that out. So those are the top and bottoms of my mortise. And to figure out the offset in, I want the rail to start 1 inch in. The shoulder is 5/16 of an inch deep. So if I set another combination square to 1 inch and 5/16, like that, and make a mark, this will be the edge of the mortise. That's all the layout that I need. And then I'll come in with a router with an edge guide, and I'll start on the line side, and I'll keep working out away from it till I get to the width that the tenon fits into, which is going to be around 7/8 of an inch. Now the footboard is going to be laid out exactly the same way. The only difference there is the tenon is only going to be 4 inches long instead of being 6 inches long, but it's laid out the same way, starting from the top side of the tenon and going down 4 inches from there. So you have this offcut from cutting a tenon to size on the end of the rails, and this is going to have to give me a really quick way to make sure that my mortise is the right size. So I'll go grab this, long, however long these things are, 6.5 foot long rails, and try and fit them in here. I have this little piece here, makes it pretty easy, so I can actually use this to make myself a mark for setting up my fence for the next cut to make this mortise to full width. So I can make a little mark there, and I can set my router bit to that point and make the next cut. So I got my test block. I can see if this is going to fit, and it is too tight. So I have to move my fence over a little bit. Pretty good. So I can finish cutting all of these, and I can chop the ends of these mortises square so they match the square tenons. And while I'm working on the rails, I'm going to run a groove in the back side of them. And this is going to help attach and align the ledger, which is going to support the mattress slats. So the stub tenons on the ends of the rails are all ready to go. So now I can take apart the head and footboard and get the post ready for all the work I have to do on those. So now I'm ready to start cutting the posts to size, and I spent a decent amount of time in SketchUp kind of running through some designs on the posts just to pick what I liked best. And what I've decided to do is to cut the posts so that they extend just a little bit above the joint here, and that'll leave this end grain exposed. I think that'd be a pretty cool look, as opposed to riding the posts all the way to the top, which is kind of what I was leaning towards in the beginning. So I printed out just a little bit of a drawing from SketchUp that has all of the little transition points in it, so I could easily bring that out here and make a full-size template. So I laid out all my transition areas and the extents of the posts onto a piece of MDF, and then I used a drawing bow to approximate the curves that I had established in the computer. And then from there, it's pretty simple just to cut the template out, and then I can refine the curves a little bit with a compass plane. This template doesn't have to be super perfect because I'm not using it as like a pattern template for routing. I'm going to be drawing it on there and then like cleaning it up by hand. So as long as it's pretty close and there aren't any like ridiculously high spots in my pattern, I should be good. So now I have my pattern here, so I'm ready to go for the whole shaping process. I'm going to start cutting these all down to length, and then I can go from there. The footboard, however, is shorter, so I'm going to make a new pattern for those ones, and I'm going to see what I can do to kind of transition from I think they're going to be like 6 inches shorter. So they kind of approximate this, but like shrunk down a little bit. So I'll be messing with that as well, but time to start cutting. So here is the template that I came up with for the footboard posts. So I took the headboard posts template and just kind of shrunk everything down a little bit. And the proportions I used on this was I had to get this thing 6 inches shorter to be the footboard. So I pulled a few inches out of here. I pulled 2 inches out of the center area. So now the center area is 3 inches long. And then I pulled 3 inches out of this section here to make this. And then up here I pulled an inch out of the top to make up the last bit of difference. And then I created some more curves with the bow again, just to find something that kind of matched the same curvature as this. So now with this created, I can cut this out and then cut all the posts and just do the whole process over again for those two footboard posts. next I'm going to start working on getting the live edges cleaned up, and I already did some experimenting on the rails versus one rail here. This is kind of the look I'm going for here. I've removed the outer bark and I've left the inner bark, and it's a pretty simple process. It was just a little bit of rough work with a draw knife to remove the majority of the bark, and then the whole area gets blended and finished with a kind of like a Scotch-Brite pad on an angle grinder. So the process is pretty simple, but I absolutely love the results of this gives. It's a really, really cool look, and I think it looks a lot better than the whole bare wood kind of look. It still has some of that organic nature to it. So I'm going to start on the headboard piece here, get this in the vise. So with the draw knife, I can come in here and remove the outer bark and just kind of leave the transition area between the outer bark and the inner bark. And that'll give me some material to remove and kind of blend together with the grinder. So the next step is going to be using one of these kind of Scotch-Brite type pads. This is a fine grit pad, and I've experimented with a couple different ways of doing this. You can use these things without the backer that they're supposed to have on them, and that's going to allow these to conform to different shapes. The issue with that in this situation is I'm trying to blend all the facets and imperfections from the draw knife together to kind of give a nice uniform surface. So this would just follow those imperfections, and it does cause the pads to wear out faster, but it's just something worth noting if you're trying to sand something that's got some, it's already like profile, doesn't need any more work done to it. Otherwise, the backer pad kind of keeps things nice and flat. And the issue here though is you have to keep this thing moving, or else this will introduce its own facets if you stop moving. So it's not that hard to use, just kind of keep moving the tool around, kind of rolling it through. In my case, as I'm trying to profile a curved surface. This one works out pretty well, and even though these are fine grit pads, they do chew through material pretty quickly, so that's why I left a little more material on the surface so I can kind of have some buffer there to grind through to create the finished surface. So the surface finish off the grinder is a little coarse, it's a little rough, so I can just go over it with some hand sanding just to smooth things out and further refine the surface. And just to give you an idea of how this would look with finish on it, here's some mineral spirits going on. So I think that makes for a really cool and dramatic effect. It's like nothing I've really ever seen before. Pretty cool, huh? So I have the headboard here and I'm getting ready to glue it up, and I'm just doing a quick check to make sure this is going to work out all right. The main thing here is I've attached these blocks of wood to the face of the boards, and that's going to help me to be able to pull them together at that angle. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to apply pressure across the joint. It would be kind of pulling it apart. So these blocks are just some cedar, and I've cut a bevel on them. They're at the same angle that the boards are at, and that allows the clamps to clamp basically squarely to that joint and pull it together nicely. So I've shown this block clamping technique a few times in the past, anytime I've done a angled glue up like this. And the idea here is that the blocks are made from a weaker material than the wood that you're gluing together. So in my case here, I have some cedar, which is pretty weak, and these are glued directly to the face of the boards with just regular Titebond glue. So the bond is extremely strong, so they're not going to pop off as I'm applying pressure. However, when I'm ready to remove them, if I hit them with a mallet hard enough or a chisel to break them off, it's the fibers in the cedar that are going to break, not the glue and not the walnut beneath it, because it is those cedar fibers that are the weakest link in that whole connection. And then I can do some surface prep, finish sanding this whole thing, and you'll never know those things were attached in the first place. And lastly, I'm going to use epoxy for this glue up for two reasons. Primarily just for the extra working time. This should go together pretty easily, but just in case, it's nice to have the extra working time. With the epoxy, I can be out here for about at least a half hour, maybe even 45 minutes, messing with things before it actually starts to grab. So that's kind of a nice thing. A secondary reason is if I can't get all of the squeeze out cleaned up, the epoxy is not going to mess with the finish. The finished area is going to look exactly the same as the epoxy on top of the wood. So it's kind of nice that way too. I don't have to worry about messing up the finish. So here we go. Here is the bed all roughly assembled, and this is like the first time I'm actually able to see this thing like at the perspective that I would be at when it's assembled and like in use. Because before, with like this, the headboard up on the bench kind of gives you a weird perspective of like your viewing angle. But looking at it now as you're like looking down upon it all, this is really cool, and I'm really excited about the way this thing is coming together. So with all of the construction complete, we can move into some finishing. And I'll be pre-finishing the headboard and footboard before I actually glue up and glue the posts to the walnut. Anytime you have the opportunity to finish something before final assembly, when things are nice and flat, a lot more manageable, definitely a great way to go. It's so much easier to finish things before they're fully assembled and have all these inside corners and stuff you have to deal with. So I'm gonna get this thing taken apart, and then we'll talk a little bit about surface prep. So proper surface prep is the single most important part about finishing. No matter how good of a finish you apply, if you apply it over a surface that's not prepared correctly, it's gonna look like junk. So I know a lot of people try and rush through this step, but this is the one time where attention to detail and spending a little bit of time at it just to make sure everything is perfect and ready to go is definitely worth it. Today I'm gonna be using mostly sander to do the finish prep, but if you have a card scraper, you can use one of these. That's going to save you a lot of time too. So the biggest thing about surface prep and sanding and all that is deciding or determining where to start, what grit to start at. So again, if you're using the card scraper, you can use this as your low grit essentially and clean up all of the rough stuff in one go with this. Now for me today, my planer knives were a little dull. So like on the walnut and on the maple, there is some, like, I guess crushed fibers or micro tear out on the walnut. The curly maple does have some tear out that I have to remove. So I know I'm going to be removing a decent amount of material to get started. So because of that, I'll be starting today at 60 grit and working from there. Now that's a very important decision to make, because your first grit you start with sanding, that grit's the only grit you ever want that's going to actually remove material. Your intention there is to use that sander to remove material. Every grit after your starting grit is only there to refine the surface and to remove the scratch pattern from the previous grit. So as I'm using that 60 grit, I'm going to really give everything a really good inspection as I'm working to make sure I get everything removed that I need to. Now on the posts, I just left these right off the bandsaw, so I know I'm going to have to refine these the saw marks a little bit too. So 60 grit on the legs will help for that. And of course, all the tear out that I have on the legs as well needs to be removed. So the whole overarching theme here with sanding is your first grit, you're going to spend the most time at that grit. You're going to spend a lot of time actually sanding the surface. All the other grits, they go by pretty quickly, because all you have to do is just go over the whole surface with the sander. You're trying to cover the surface with the sander and evenly scratch that surface to remove the deeper scratches from the lower grit. So far I've gone from 60 to 80 to 120, and I'm about to go to 180. And at this point, after 120, the surface should be nice and smooth. 120 is pretty good for like the scratch pattern. It is very hard to see a 120 scratch pattern, but it is kind of in there, it's kind of murky, but you should not see any visible scratches or swirls at this point. So between the grits, I like to hit the surface with some compressed air. This is going to knock off the dust and any bits of the grit from the previous sanding. And that'll keep those little bits of grit, if there are any on the surface, from being trapped between the wood and the new sandpaper and making more scratches on the surface, at least in theory. So now that the surface is all sanded, I'm going to work on getting these edges all ready to go. And down here, I just blunted the corners with the sander. I'm going to finish it off with some sandpaper. I have some 150 grit, and then I'll finish that off with 180, and then also break these edges here. Now I don't want to go up too high because the posts end here, and I want the intersection of the walnut and the maple post to be nice and square. So I'm just going to feather it into here, just kind of feather into that this blunting area here. And since this end grain is going to be exposed on the project, I want to clean it up pretty nice. This is a hand plane surface, but it is a little rough here, so I'm just going to hit it with some 220 just to kind of smooth it out. There's a little bit of, there's maybe a small track mark here, but overall the cut from the hand plane was just a little bit on the rough side. And I also have to finish up the edge here. This is only sanded to 120, so I'm just going to go over the bark section here again, and now that the faces are done, I can blend the corners into the faces. Now this might be the most important step in the whole process, and that is checking your work and getting a preview of what this is going to look like when you put finish on it. At this point, I'm going to wipe this whole thing down with mineral spirits, and that is going to do two things for me. For one, it's going to clean off a little bit of the dust here. I'm actually going to leave some dust on the surface. This is walnut, and it's porous, so a little bit of the sawdust will stay on the surface for that first coat. That'll help fill the pores a little bit. Just a little thing I do with walnut. The other thing it's going to do is that finishes bring out imperfections. Any imperfections in the surface you'll be able to see instantly with finish on there. So wouldn't it be nice if you could see what it's going to look like before actually applying finish? Well, that's exactly what this step will do. So the mineral spirits will go on there, and that'll reveal exactly what this is going to look like when I apply my finish. Now I'm using mineral spirits because I'm going to be using an oil-based finish, and it's thinned with mineral spirits. If you're using like shellac, for instance, you can do the same thing with denatured alcohol without any issues. Like I could apply finish to this right as it is right now. So as I'm applying this on here, it actually looks pretty darn good. I don't see any scratches or major imperfections that I missed.
So one thing I want to point out is this bit of tear out here. This is actually a really deep area of chip out from the planer as those knives came across that undulating grain there. It tore a giant piece of wood out. Now to fix this, I have to dish out this area, basically bring the surface level down over 1/8 of an inch, and then feather all that area back to make that low spot not noticeable. Now I decided to just leave this as is because this is actually below the level of the mattress, so you're never really going to be able to see this.
But I can tell you what, I am pretty excited to get some finish on here because this is pretty ridiculously good looking here. I'm going to get in close, kind of change my angles a lot as I'm looking at the surface, trying to get some raking light coming in down off the, I have some lamps above the workbench here, and they'll provide a little bit of a raking light if I can get the angle just right with my head. So that's what the surface looks like right now. Honestly, I can't see any scratches, any dents, any imperfections. That's looking pretty good. So I'll do the same check on the other side, and then this one will be ready for finish. All right, here's this side. My mineral spirits is flashing off already. But yeah, this one's also looking pretty darn good. So the posts have also been sanded all the way through 180 grit, and now it's time for some of their finishing details. I'm going to put a chamfer on the bottom edges of the posts, and that's going to prevent the leg stock from splitting if this thing is dragged across the floor. Just kind of eases this corner here. Also going to break all the edges, give it a really light round over, a chamfer kind of thing, and the same thing on the top side. That'll get a little bit of a light chamfer as So one other detail on here is that some of these still have a little bit of bark on here. I think this one has the most. The other one's just a little bit. So I'm just going to blend away some of the bark here, and hopefully I can get this looking kind of like the walnut in the headboard and footboard. Yeah, maybe something like that. That's kind of a cool look. It kind of matches the walnut a little bit. So before I get ready to put finish on the rails, I still have to attach the blocks which are going to hold the bolts, which is going to hold the whole bed together. So down here on the footboard side, I have one bolt, and then on the headboard side, I'm just going to do 2 bolts because I have more real estate down there. So this is just going to get glued in place. I'm going to clamp a little edge guide here to the tenon so that the shoulder is kind of, I don't know, in line up here. So that way I can butt this block up against here and glue it in place. And lastly, I'm going to stick a piece of paper between the edge here and my block. And that's going to give a little bit of space there so that when the bolt gets tightened up, it's going to cause the shoulder on the front side of this tenon to fully seat before this block happens to bottom out against the post. So since this is kind of a goofy thing to finish with the, I guess, the angles in here, I have this up on a couple of sticks. That's going to just keep it off the table a little bit. I'm starting on the least important side because I'll be flipping this over on top of the sticks, this is the back side. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about the finishing process here. I do have a whole video about this whole process I'm about to do. If you haven't seen it, I'll leave a link up there in the cards and in the description to that, so you can take a look at that one if you haven't seen it already. All right, so I did my typical application of finish onto all the bed parts. I did 5 coats of finish, and now I'm ready to start on some assembly. And one thing I thought I'd mention as I'm getting going here, just to give people a realistic expectation of like how much time I actually spent on finish prep, took me a little over 4 hours. So that was me in here sanding, making sure all the surfaces were good to go, nice and smooth, and all that stuff. All the edges were broken. End grain was sanded nicely and smooth, all that stuff, a little over 4 hours. And for me, I think that's pretty easy to justify. If you're going to be building a piece of work to this caliber, 4 hours to make sure that thing is, perfect and is everything you want it to be is a small investment. Like when I finished the secretary desk, that was a solid 2 full days of finish prep. But I also had a few hundred hours into it. So, 16 to 20 hours of finish prep, less than 5% of the overall time to build the piece, it seems like a very valid investment of time. That's my thing about finish prep, I guess. So I'm going to start getting the headboard assembled, and that's going to be basically just a breadboard end assembly. So to kind of protect my finish here, and help me with my layout, I'm going to put some blue tape onto the surface here, and I'll lay out my lines, my hole locations on that tape. Now the exact placement of these holes, this is going to be super important. I'm just going to get them eyeballed into center of the mortises. And then I'll just make a mark to indicate how far back they're going to be, and I'm going to do, let's do 3/4. That seems like a good amount. So I can drill these holes at the drill press. I'm not going to go all the way through the leg with this. I'm going to do a half blind painting, so you'll only be able to see the pegs from one side of the leg. These legs are pretty, they're pretty thick, so it'd be pretty hard to drill. Well, I guess it would be that hard, but I could drill all the way through, but it's really not necessary for this. And the next thing I'm going to do is mark the hole locations on the hole locations from the mortises onto the tenons. And I'll use the same drill bit that I used to drill the holes. It's a brad point drill bit, so when I drop it down the hole, it'll put a center mark onto the tenons. So now I have the hole location marked on the tenon, and what I'm going to do is actually move my hole location towards the shoulder just a little bit. And what that's going to do is when I force a dowel through this joint, it's going to pull the tenon deeper into the mortise and make the shoulder line really tight. I'm also going to angle the drill at roughly the angle that the bed is splayed back, because the dowel or the hole through the mortises is not going to be square to the face of this tenon. So here's where the magic of the breadboard end comes in. This panel is going to want to expand and contract as the humidity changes throughout the seasons, and the way it's inserted into the post, that post isn't going to get any taller or shorter. So this panel needs to be able to float as it's attached there. And typically on a breadboard end, you would fix the center and you allow the outside two tenons to float, which I could do here. But what I'm going to do is actually fix the top and allow the bottom two tenons to float. So basically, I'm fixing this location here, and these are going to move that way. So I can direct the wood movement into whatever direction I want. I can send it that way, or you can send it in both ways. You can send it up this way. Doesn't really matter which way you send it, as long as you make an allocation for it. What I'm going to be doing here is using a file to elongate these holes, basically turn them into slots, and that'll give the dowel that I drive through here a little bit of back and forth movement, so that as this panel expands and contracts, the dowel can pass through the slot, or the slot can pass around the dowel, because the slot will be moving at the dowel. And that'll allow this thing to stay connected to the post, because the dowel is still going to be applying pressure at the front side of this hole, and at the same time allow this panel to float and not get bound up. Now I'm not going to need a really wide slot here. I'm only really going to allow for maybe a 1/16 or an 1/8 of an inch at the most at the far end, and that's going to be a little bit different from like a tabletop where you have a much wider panel, which is going to experience a lot more movement. For something like that, you probably want to go to at least a 1/4 inch on the very end tenon. All right, so this finished up my last test fit. This looks pretty good. I made the dowels. I went with walnut for the stock for those. I was going to use maple for low contrast, but I figure, why not go for a little bit more contrast to keep kind of that contrasty flow thing going on. So I'm going to take this thing apart and we'll do some gluing. This is kind of a scary moment here. So I'm using epoxy again for this glue up, just for the working time, just in case. I don't really want to have any surprises at this stage. So I'm only applying glue to the first tenon here and just a little bit of the stub, maybe a total of 4 inches or so of total glued area. I'll glue the underside too. Ooh. So the first dowel gets glued into the hole, and I put a little bit of a point on the end of the dowels here. That's going to help it clear that little stepped area as it passes through the tenon. You can see how tightly that pulled the shoulder. And now I'm just going to keep hammering this down until I hear the pitch change, and then I know it's bottomed out in the hole. So these ones just go in dry, and then once they get down far enough, I'll put a little glue on the top here. That way they get glued in the hole to the post itself and not to the tenon. That just keeps them from backing out of the hole. Yeah, look at that. Tight. So the glue is set up overnight, and this is kind of the trade-off with pre-finishing something like this with exposed joinery, is that now I need to clean up these pegs and get them flushed up without damaging the finish that I already applied. So I'm going to go pretty carefully with a flush trim saw, trim away as much of the dowel as possible. The blue tape here is going to help protect the surface of the post as I saw through that, and then I can clean up the rest of the material with a little bit of chisel work. And then lastly here, I'll just hit it with some 600 grit sandpaper to clean up any little bit of surface imperfection, and then I'll just give it a light coat of finish just to even things out and to get some finish onto the end grain of these dowels. So now the last thing to do is to make the mattress support system, and that is going to start with a ledger that's going to rest in this groove here that's in both of the rails. And to make that ledger, I'm going to use this piece of ash here. This is a chunk of ash that my friend and I cut on his swing blade sawmill about 2 years ago. That was a fun video if you haven't seen that one before. And then the mattress support itself, the slats are going to be made from a few extra pieces of flooring that I had made when I did the flooring project like a year and a half ago. So for the flooring here, I'll just rip the tongue and groove off, and then these will become the slats that will rest on the ledger, which will be attached to the rails of the bed. So side rails are going to attach to the head and footboard with the socket head cap screws. So I'm going to transfer the hole locations from my blocks to the posts so I know where to drill the holes. Those holes are going to get drilled out and tapped for that socket head cap screw to thread into. Doing it this way will allow me to have no visible hardware from the outside, but this can still be very easily disassembled to be moved around. To tap the holes, I'm using these thread taps that my friends Mark and Andy developed. They're longer than normal taps, which is going to be nice for this application so I can have even more threads in the post. And they also have a hex shank that can be easily grabbed with a drill. Now I have the pre-production version of these, but the new versions of these, the threads that the tap actually cuts are a little bit undersized. So the first time you put a bolt down the hole, the threads on the bolt will actually compress the fibers and kind of burnish them a bit, making them even stronger and having a really good grip on the threads. Now this is still going to be plenty strong for what I'm doing here because I'll have so much thread engagement. So I'm going to use a few core 20 bolts to hold the ledger to the rail. I'm going to tap the holes in the rails just like I did with the holes in the posts. And that's going to allow us to come on and off pretty easily as this bed needs to be disassembled, since this ledger is going to be in the way of the bolt on the end there. So this ledger has to come off before the rails can come off. So I'm super happy with the way this thing turned out. If you follow along from the beginning, you know it's kind of evolved as I went, and I really allowed the wood to kind of dictate a lot of the things on the piece. I really like the contrast between the walnut and the maple, but I especially love how the sapwood that I left in the walnut kind of flows into the maple and kind of gives a nice unifying element there. I also really like the subtle playfulness on symmetry and asymmetry in the bed. The headboard and the footboard are both book matched, so you have some symmetry there, but only the top edge has a live edge, so it's technically asymmetrical. I also really like the height of the posts. I think they're a really good height to give more focus to the walnut panels, and I think the overall curvature and the shape of the legs really kind of lends well to the natural curvature in the rest of the wood. So I'm also really excited because this is the first piece of furniture that I've made that incorporated a live edge, and I'm super excited by the results. I think this bed was a really great candidate for incorporating a live edge because it doesn't really detract from the overall look. It kind of blends in nicely and it just has a really cool feel. And I really like that I left the live edge on the rails because I think that really gives a really unique look to the whole piece. Not to mention the crotch section down there that flows into the leg, kind of like a brace. I'm really happy I did that as opposed to cutting that just straight and leaving it kind of a standard squared off looking rail. So that's it for this one. I hope you enjoyed this series. I know I did. Thank you as always for watching. I greatly appreciate it. If you have any questions or comments on the bed build or anything back in the shop, please feel free to leave me a comment. As always, I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. And until next time, happy woodworking.